So 70 years this Sunday. Now, the world has changed just a wee bit in the last 70 years. So, thanks to Jan Parkinson, I have a few facts on this one. Gas was 17 cents a gallon. Minimum wage, 70 cents per hour. This, if you were to look at what was going to be Mission Road and you were to look at the location of where we are right now, this is what you would have seen outside the church. Now, you notice, so we had squatters. There was a little hut here, a little house where the groundskeeper for the golf course that was being constructed was living, and you can see his outhouse in this picture as well. That was on this lot. And this lot cost $11,000 for all of it. And it was actually a larger lot in those days, too. It kind of got pared down over time, too. It was just a few years after the Second World War, and the baby boom had started. And former veterans were moving into this neighborhood in droves. And those were really optimistic days in a lot of ways. And so there was this group here where 17 adults met. This was Founders Day. The church used to meet at the parsonage right across the street. And so 17 adults got together in December. Now they were squatting too. They weren't supposed to be having worship services over there, but nobody knew the laws, and so they did it anyway. So their first official service as a congregation was in January, the last Sunday in January. So look at these people who met back then. What do you notice about them? Yell it out so I can hear you. What do you notice about the people? They're young. They're young. A lot of kids. 17 adults maybe, but there's a lot of kids in that picture. It was the baby boom for sure. Now, back in those days, these United States were right about 90% of the people who lived in the United States considered themselves white. It was a vast majority. And Prairie Village in those days was a sundown town. And that meant that if you were a person who wasn't considered to be white, you had to leave the city before the sun set. The world has changed a lot in 70 years. And there are a lot of stories from these years. People from this church community, they were the ones who helped to challenge the racist laws and eventually saw those laws removed. And I think that over the last few weeks, as we've been talking about race, this is what has struck me the most. It's been the stories of people who have been part of this community. What have they seen? It's the stories about people in this church community who stood in loving solidarity across racial divides back in the 50s by the simple act of being the only non-African American person to go to a funeral, and what that meant at that time, because that was not done. I've heard stories about people who changed. Their attitudes about people who looked differently and from different areas changed, and who confess this now, who challenge themselves to tear down the idol of whiteness. And can I tell you how much I respect and how much I honor a person who is willingly, openly to admit that they were wrong, and then to work to change yourself. I've heard some honest stories these last few weeks, and I am honored to be with people who are willing to be transformed and to grow into the stature of Christ Jesus. This is the work of church. And the life of this church community, just 50 years ago, we saw the National Guard placing armed barricades on State Line Road following the riots that broke out after the assassination of Martin Luther King. There were people in the National Guard who are in this congregation now who are there. I learned a little tidbit. The soldiers were not given bullets. Didn't know that before today. Last month, we remembered Marilyn Upman's righteous work against racism and intolerance, and that's a work that we will continue. Colonial Church has a legacy of sharing Christ's inclusive influence, and the stories that we have as a community, they matter. But along the way, there came points where we crossed over. Those moments when things change and they never go back to being the way they were before. Now, for the United States as a whole, March 7th, 1965 was such a moment. 400 people were marching as a group together from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, over voting rights that had been denied. They had been made legal by the government, but they were not being observed. They were not being enforced. And so they came to this bridge. This is a bridge that was named for a former Confederate general, a guy named Edmund Pettus, who then later became a Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan. And on this bridge, state troopers and police brutally beat those who marched as they crossed over. Because of television, the entire world bore witness to this brutality and the evil of racism. Racism being hate plus power. And that witness changed the world. Crossing over is not an entirely safe thing to do. Crossing over means leaving behind the safety of what you knew or what you thought you knew. And the stories of crossing over are scary. Those with the guts to do it have no assurance for their own safety. Even with the absolute conviction and the hopeful promise of the future, that doesn't necessarily mean that if you are the one who are out on the bridge, that you yourself are going to get there.
When Moses sent them out to explore the land of Canaan, he said to them, "Go up there into the arid southern plain and into the mountains. You must inspect the land. What is it like? Are the people who live in it strong or weak, few or many? Is the land in which they live good or bad? Are the towns in which they live camps or fortresses? Is the land rich or poor? Are there trees in it or not? Be courageous and bring back the land's fruit." It was the season of the first ripe grapes. They returned from exploring the land after 40 days. They went directly to Moses, Aaron, and the entire Israelite community in the Paran Desert at Kadesh. They brought back a report to them and to the entire community and showed them the land's fruit. Then they gave their report. "We entered the land to which you sent us. It's actually full of milk and honey, and this is its fruit. There are, however, powerful people who live in the land. The cities have huge fortifications, and we even saw the descendants of the Anakites there. The Amalekites live in the land of the arid southern plain. The Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the mountains. And the Canaanites live by the sea and along the Jordan." Now Caleb calmed the people before Moses and said, "We must go up and take possession of it, because we are more than able to do it." But the men who went up with him said, "We can't go up against the people because they are stronger than we." They started a rumor about the land that they had explored, telling the Israelites, "The land that we crossed over to explore is a land that devours its residents. All the people we saw in it are huge men. We saw there the Nephilim, the descendants of Anak, come from Nephilim. We saw ourselves as grasshoppers, and that's how we appeared to them.
The Nephilim, these were legendary giants of the ancient world, creatures like the gods that are pictured in Greek mythology, huge and powerful. The people were scared. And for some people, to make the decision to cross over, it's a numbers game for them. Do you have the power to overcome? Do you have the resources and the numbers? And the truth was that the Israelites did not have the numbers on their side. They had been wandering around the desert for 40 years. They did not have the military resources to stand against the walled cities of Canaan. The marchers on that bridge were unarmed. They had no chance in a clash with the police and state troopers. Crossing over, though, it's more than a numbers game. It's about faith. It's about conviction and trusting that there are better days ahead on the other side. And that's what Caleb knew. He heard the report and he saw the fear in people and he came back and he said, the only way for us to get into the promised future is to cross over. We're headed for another crossing over. Now, right now, if you look at the neighborhood of Prairie Village 70 years later, Prairie Village actually looks demographically a lot like the United States did in 1949. But the rest of the nation certainly doesn't. Whereas 90% of the people in 1949 thought of themselves as white, today that number is less than 70%. And in about 20 years, there will be no racial majority in these United States. We will cross over into a new reality. And it's going to be good. I believe that. But can't you feel the fear around us? The resistance, the fear of losing power. Fear of somehow being outnumbered. Maybe you've seen some of those emails that go out sometimes that are just explicitly about feeling like you're afraid of being outnumbered. And there are people who will try to manipulate the system to try to hang on to this idea of whiteness, of the power that comes with that, as long as they possibly can. And so I think that Colonial Church's future is going to be a Caleb future. The stories that we're going to create are going to, in the years to come, are going to be about a people preparing to cross over into a new reality with conviction and with faith. Now, just this week, because I went to the Moore Squared meeting on Monday, on MLK Day, I came away committed to meeting with a pastor of Latino congregation meeting in Overland Park as the hope to build a relationship for the future. And I don't know how that's going to go. In fact, I thought to myself, basically it's like making a cold call. I honestly didn't think that they were going to call me back. I made the effort, and honestly I was like, hey, I did my job. I made the call. They got back in touch with me immediately. We're meeting tomorrow. I don't know how it's going to go. But I know that by coming together, there are better days ahead. And that's a story that I want to be part of. What has really affected me in the last few weeks is the stories. They were even happening after the first service today. Those stories, those small acts of courage in the hope for a better world, of going to a funeral for a black friend back in 1953. Now, of course, that was the right and the righteous thing to do, is to go to somebody's funeral. But that was done in the name of love in a time where that wasn't done. How about learning Spanish in order to talk to the parents and the family of the one that you fell in love with? Oh, the things we'll do in the name of love. Lives bound together with these stories of love and courage. These are our stories, and we're going to continue to write them. As youth and adults in our church community, we're going to have the opportunity in the next year or so to go with the United Church of Christ congregations out to a Native American reservation that we formed a partnership with, and to experience a part of America that most people don't get to see. And I promise you, for those who go on that, there will be stories. As our missions in Honduras and Malawi, as they continue and we continue to form those relationships, there will be stories. And as we approach these coming, crossing over moments, we're going to prepare ourselves by continuing the legacy of reaching out beyond the divisions that we face as a city and that we face as a nation. And it's going to have to be intentional, because it's not just going to magically happen. Sometimes it's even going to feel forced as you do the hard work of building bridges of dialogue, working for common purpose. It means going to events that you may not feel comfortable at. It means going to dinners sometimes where you go to the Dialogue Institute dinners and you think, what are we possibly going to talk about? It's not always easy. But here's the thing. In 70 years, what are the stories that they're going to tell about us? Or we are doing now? What are our children who are here, who are those little children back 70 years ago? What are the stories that they are going to say of us? Because with each act of conviction and faith that we do to build a better world, to build the beloved kingdom, we will continue to be Christ's church. And it's going to happen because of the choices that you make, that we make together. That's the legacy of who we've been and who we will be. Those Calebs with conviction. The faith to trust that there are better days ahead on the other side. May this be our way as we walk together in Christian love. Amen. Will you now stand together as we honor the hope of those founding members 70 years ago, that this church community would extend the inclusive love of Christ throughout the world as we sing, "They Did Not Build in Vain." Please rise.